Hello, my name's Leon. I'm a psychotherapist and also a life coach. And today I want to talk about addressing symptoms of obsessive thinking and OCD at the root of it. So what are some ways you could do to be able to cope with OCD and obsessive thinking? How can you be able to fundamentally root out these symptoms? This is what I want to talk about here. I've been working with people with obsessive thinking and also OCD, and I have this myself, though it's been greatly reduced over time. When people approach OCD, something that makes it really unhelpful for them is when they simply have a just quit it approach. Like they just use a very simplified, I'm just going to stop this obsessive thinking, OCD, and just do it cold turkey. This is a very misguided kind of behavioral approach. There's a place for being able to address OCD at a behavioral level, but it's not through this very oversimplified approach. When you do that, it only works for a little bit of time, temporarily, maybe a few days, but then all the obsessive thinking and OCD just comes back. Because what's happening is that you're not really addressing the root of the problem. And that's why I really believe that it's important to address OCD and obsessive thinking from different approaches. So the first approach that comes to mind is through an existentialist lens. You may not think that has anything to do with OCD, but it really does help. The second one is through a mindfulness lens, how you could be able to use mindfulness practice to help with OCD. The last one here, or maybe the third one here, is using a CBT approach, what people typically seek out when they want to address OCD. If you do this in a oversimplified way, it's not going to be as helpful. But I still find CBT to be very helpful when it's used in conjunction with these other approaches and when it's used in a more sophisticated kind of way. Added to CBT is exposure response prevention, because that is the validated approach empirically to be able to deal with CBT symptoms. And the last part is really about allowing for imperfection in your life, even when you are addressing OCD. Because as people who are obsessively minded, we may seek perfection, even when it comes to addressing obsessive thoughts and compulsions. So I feel like a powerful image to be able to work with is you could almost imagine someone with OCD as someone who has a inflexible body. I mean this metaphorically. OCD is involved with a lot of rigid and inflexible thoughts. So you kind of imagine somebody who has a rigid and inflexible body, their body's kind of like locked up into a stooped posture, for example. You can't solve the issue by telling them, okay, now it's time to do a split. It's gonna cause a lot of stress on the body to be able to do that, and you're not gonna just cure it overnight. So if someone has an inflexible body, what do? You have to teach them to get a little bit more flexible over time. Eventually the body becomes more flexible and more loose. The same thing with OCD, obsessive thinking. It's some sort of brain wiring that is really inflexible and rigid and almost like knotted up together, and you want to gently loosen it up and have that thinking to become more and more flexible over time. And it's a process, and people who have obsessive thinking, they don't like processes. They just want to get to the answer due to perfectionism, and learning that this is a process is all a part of this. So let's talk about the first angle by which we are addressing OCD, and that's through the existential lens. So there's this really great psychotherapist called Viktor Frankl who has worked with people with obsessive compulsive disorder, and he noticed an underlying theme. A lot of his clients have existential concerns. And not only that, their OCD and obsessive thinking seems to be rooted in those existential concerns. And when I work with my clients who have obsessive thinking OCD, I find that to be the case as well. I'm not saying everybody, all people who have this condition, but a great many of them tend to have existential concerns, and it seems like the obsessive thinking and OCD is rooted in that. And I would say that is the case for myself too, as well. So if you look at existentialism, it's about our attitude towards the world. Everyone faces a life that's full of uncertainty, and everything in life is ephemeral. Everything comes and it goes. And yes, everyone deals with existential concerns, but for people with obsessive thinking and OCD, that anxiety around it gets manifested into these very specific thoughts and compulsions as a way to gain control over a life that is uncertain and ephemeral. At a conscious level, they're aware this form of thinking is not going to help them address these concerns. It only temporarily alleviates it. But there's a subconscious side of themselves that can't let go of that notion. I find that in order to be able to address OCD and obsessive thinking, it helps to use CBT, but you also need to go deeper in OCD. You want to get to the root of where these obsessive thoughts and compulsions come from, and it helps to do so from an existential lens. Say that you have obsessive thoughts or compulsions around safety and health. You want to be able to address the underlying existential concerns. If you just do it at a surface level, like, you just tell yourself, I'm just going to stop doing these safety behaviors. I'm just going to stop over-checking my health. That is not really getting to the root of the problem, because the root is more existential. So you want to address the bigger question of, how can I live a quality life? Because that's what safety and health is really about, how you could be able to live a comfortable and healthy life. But the compulsion and obsessive thinking tries to overdo it by getting into the nitty-gritty details. So you want to look at it from a broader perspective of, how can I have a quality of life without sweating so much of the details? And look at less at a quantitative level, like I need to keep checking every single day, to a more qualitative level. Well, of course, adhering to the quantitative, but not so obsessively. And maybe you have an obsession about how old you are, or getting things just right. The underlying existential theme here is about perfectionism, because we want life to be perfection, because perfection is a way to control life. Let's look at it from instead, how can we live a life that is a life that is meaningful without having to have all the details correct? Or what does a good life look like that has a bit of give, that allows for imperfection to be there? And to approach this question from that broader level and come up with a meaningful answer that gets answered over time. It's a process, it's not something you can just immediately answer right away. If you try to use a superficial approach to CBT compared to a sophisticated approach to CBT, this is not going to work. If you try to supplant your obsessive, intrusive, negative thoughts with superficial cognitive reframes, that's not going to be helpful for you, because you already know that what your mind is telling you is irrational at a conscious level. So just try to question that rationality of those thoughts in itself tends not to be that helpful. These thoughts are grounded and come from a deeper existential source. So if you want to do reframing, you want to take the existential component into account. One thing about intrusive thoughts is that you can't simply force them out of your mind. Again, that only works temporarily. This next approach that I want to talk about is the mindfulness approach. The mindfulness approach is the solution to how do we deal with intrusive, obsessive thoughts if we cannot force them out. So mindfulness is a non-forceful approach for dealing with negative, obsessive thinking. Mindfulness approaches are rooted in Eastern philosophy, which deal with our existential concerns. The reason why we have existential dread is because we grasp onto things. We grasp onto certainties, just like I kind of mentioned earlier. For instance, we might want perfectionism in our lives, and we might have trouble dealing with the ephemerality of life. So OCD is a manifestation of this tendency to grasp. It's trying to hold onto something in order to create certainty. Of course, we know it doesn't make sense, but the motivation behind it is subconscious. It's almost like a form of magical thinking. If somehow I have these obsessive thoughts and I do these compulsions, things will be magically all right. So mindfulness teaches us how to loosen our grasp. So one way we do that is to actually have tolerance for the obsessive thought. So when an obsessive thought comes in, the reason why it gives it a lot of stress is that there's a lot of resistance towards the thought. And the more we try to push it away, the more we can't get rid of it. It's like if I were to tell you to stop thinking about a pink elephant, you're always going to be thinking about a pink elephant. So mindfulness, you take a look at the thought and you notice the thought with a sense of curiosity and you name it. You acknowledge its existence. And by doing so, you take away some of its power over you because your mind reacts to the thought like it's a big threat. The first step is to notice, name, and actually give space for the thought and also give space for negative feelings that may arise. Cease struggling with those thoughts and those feelings. And then when you do so, then what you could do is that you take the thought and you gently put it away. You do it in an artful kind of way rather than a forceful kind of way. How you do it is by showing yourself kindness and compassion. Instead of beating yourself up for having this obsessive thought, acknowledge the pain and gently put the thought away. The next approach I want to talk about is using CBT, and as part of CBT, using exposure and response prevention. Despite my criticisms of CBT, I'm actually a really big fan of CBT. I feel like it should be used in a more sophisticated, nuanced sort of way. I feel like the reframes need to be grounded more in a existential philosophy. If you just take an obsessive thought and you frame that obsessive thought, and you take another obsessive thought and you reframe that obsessive thought, that could be useful, but it doesn't really get to the root of it because there is a connection between all the obsessive thoughts. And that connection, as I said, has an existential basis. So if you want to supplant those negative thoughts, you want to get to the root of it and create a existential philosophy that is stronger than the one that the OCD has. If you're simply reframing things on the surface, but you're not addressing that greater existential concern, the subconscious OCD thoughts are just going to take back over again. The reason why we may rush to use CBT and quickly try to come up with reframes is that we really want to have a solution for our OCD. However, that could just become part of the problem because part of OCD is this need for perfectionism and trying to force that perfectionism. And when CBT is used in an incorrect way, it's basically aligned with obsessive thinking. So that's why it's important to bring in that existential component and mindfulness component. Then I think reframes could be really helpful. Actually, I have found that for my own intrusive obsessive thoughts, I have been able to repeat helpful coping statements using CBT, and when I repeat them enough, I find them to be believable and I'm able to address it. If you're not doing the mindfulness thing and you're forcing the reframes, that is not going to be healthy for you. The reframes also need to be nuanced and reflective of reality. They can't just simply contradict in a very simplistic manner the OCD thought. And later on, I'll give you an example from my own obsessive thoughts, how you could apply mindfulness, CBT, and also existentialism as well. Exposure and response prevention is about allowing yourself to be put into situations that may elicit your obsessive thinking or your compulsions. And when you do so, you don't act on your compulsions and you don't give into your compulsive thinking either. And over time, through this practice, you get better at dealing with OCD. And I think this certainly is a very important component. I almost liken this to practicing yoga. You're really doing the practice. You're really putting yourself in situations where you are feeling that lack of flexibility and you're making yourself actively more flexible. I think this approach works really well if you could take the other approaches into account. If you could practice the mindfulness component, that's going to help with the ERP. Because the mindfulness component, you can pretty much look at it like meditation. You're practicing that internal flexibility, how you can take a thought and gently put it away, but in an artful kind of manner. And ERP is doing that almost like out more in the real world. It's like the yoga. Yoga is not going to work well if you don't have that internal mindfulness. With ERP, you can even get to the point where you deliberately do the opposite of your compulsion, and you'll find that you'll be able to do it. I've been able to do it for my own obsessive thinking and deliberately do things that are contrary to my sense of perfectionism, and through little bits of exposure, and yes, it does take a little bit of stress, but manageable amounts, you'll be able to overcome that feeling of perfection or whatever kind of obsessive thinking that you have. So I want to tie everything together with an example, and I feel like the best example is a personal example from my own life. I've hesitated in bringing this in this video because of embarrassment, but I feel like it would be useful. I have this obsession when it comes to numbers and also getting things just right. And underlying these two obsessions is this overall need for perfection. And this tendency that I have has greatly reduced over time, though I still have it to an extent. How I used to deal with it is by forcefully trying to get rid of my compulsive thoughts. But what I find is that they just come right back into my mind and I just get really stressed out. And I've used these CBT reframes before, but not in a helpful way. So I realized I need to learn patience and really deeply explore my need for perfectionism at an existential level, not rush the process and just quickly come up with a solution, but really try to understand where that need for perfectionism comes from and how to supplant it with a philosophy that's more meaningful about life. So this need for perfectionism comes from having to have control over my life. But I realized that is not the way to live. I want to live a life that does not get into the weeds and into the details of having everything exactly in its place. And I want to be able to let go of that. I want life to have more of a gift to it. And over time, when I'm teaching myself this new philosophy, I find it to be more meaningful for my life, and I'm finding it to be more believable over time. And then I started creating reframes that are based on this deeper philosophy of how I want to live life, a life that I feel like gives me more freedom than the constrictions of a perfectionist life. Part of this desire to work towards non-perfectionism is how I treat the process of overcoming my own non-perfectionism. I realize it's helpful to bring in mindfulness rather than try to push away my thoughts in a black way so I could perfectly get rid of my negative thinking. I need to treat it more like a process, more like an art. Be patient with it, allow the thought to come in, sit with the discomfort, and then gently put it away. And I also use the CBT reframes when I have these negative or obsessive thoughts. I would tell myself that life is imperfect, nothing in life needs to be or has to be precise. I could live with imperfection in my life. I want to live with life that has more of a gift to it. And I remind myself of the philosophy I want to live by through these reframes. And by repeating them, I find them to be more believable. Not only that, the more I repeat them, I find that they automatically come up. So when I have these automatic negative thoughts, what happens is that the reframes start to show up too. Then I started to do the ERP, which was practicing deliberately doing things that were contrary to my sense of perfectionism, choosing the wrong numbers, and doing things that are not just right. And through exposure, I was able to get better and better and better. What I learned is that OCD is a resistance to existential anxiety. That's why it has these compulsions in obsessive thinking. By employing them, it assumes that it gets rid of these anxieties as quickly as possible. I can't tolerate the existence of these anxieties. So I realized that if I am treating my own process of trying to get rid of my OCD with a sense of perfectionism, I'm giving into this fear of existential anxiety. It's just furthering my OCD. I'm trying to compulsively try to get rid of it because I can't tolerate that existential anxiety. This is why the mindfulness component comes in. It's about being able to tolerate existential anxiety and allow it to be there. And yes, that also includes allowing the obsessive thinking to exist and learn how to gently put it away rather than using this black and white forceful approach. I hope that you found this to be helpful. If you do, please click like and subscribe to support this channel.